So I'm just going to go ahead and introduce myself really quickly. My name is Karen Gravelin. I am the library consultant for inclusive services with the Vermont Department of Libraries, as well as the director of the ABLE Library. And we are so pleased to be partnering with Inclusive Arts Vermont to offer this accessibility series training. And with that, I will give it back to you all. Thank you.
As we begin, we pause to acknowledge the place we exist, connect, and create is the traditional unsurrendered territory of the Abenaki people, one of 5 Wabanaki nations who have a continued and enduring presence with this land. Presence with waters, with winds, with mountains, with vistas, with forests, presence with light. In Abenaki, Waban refers to the white flickering light in the sky, and a key is the word for land or the earth. So the Abenaki are the people of the Dawn Lands. We honor Abenaki ancestors past, present, and future. And with that, I'll introduce myself. My name is Heidi Swevens. I use she, they pronouns. I am the Director of Community Partnerships at Inclusive Arts Vermont. And for access purposes, I will do a visual description of myself and surroundings. I have pale skin and blue eyes with short brown hair. Today I'm wearing a turquoise button-down shirt. Behind me is an abstract rectangular painting with blues and purples and yellows against a whitish wall. And I'm thrilled to be here today to talk about accessible virtual meetings and events. And we'll go into lots of detail concepts, but I'm going to pass it over to Alexandra now for her introduction and some welcoming remarks as well. Thanks for being here.
Great. Hello, everyone. My name is Alexandra Turner. I'm the Director of School and Community Programs with Inclusive Arts Vermont. For access purposes, my verbal description, I'm a light-skinned woman with freckles, blue eyes, and shoulder-length brown hair. I'm wearing a blue short-sleeve dress, and I'm kind of standing in my office, which has a angled white wall and some kind of wooden shelves behind me. And it's kind of dark behind me, but there's like a plant and some other shelves behind me. I'm standing in today for Katie Miller. So if you've been here at the other Access series workshops, Katie's on vacation, so I'm here. If you'd like to, feel free to please introduce yourselves in the chat box. Say who you are, where you're from, and note that on Zoom, chat is accessible to some and not to all. So I will do some amount of reading out. I'm not going to read everyone's introductions, but I'll do some amount of reading out questions or comments in the chat box as they come through. We're going to invite you today to take care of yourself. If you need to take a break to use the bathroom, get a drink of water, do whatever you need to do. If you need to be joined by your cat, your dog, your little people, whoever it is, no worries. We love it when you have your cameras on, but we know that if your cameras are off, it's just you taking care of yourself. And feel free to unmute and ask questions out loud also, even if your camera's off. If you could, when you speak out, if you can tell us your name and give us a verbal description of yourself and surroundings. That is an accessible practice for people who are blind or have low vision. And this session is being recorded and will be available after this, after today on the Vermont Department of Libraries website. Maybe, I don't know how long it takes to get up there. Somebody else who knows more can tell me how long it'll take to get up there. I don't know if it'll be there like tomorrow, but sometime soon. Okay, schedule, Heidi, take it away.
Great, thank you. And the recording, just to close that loop, will not be up tomorrow, but soon. We are in summer vacation schedules, and just you can continue to look or reach out to Karen or I to see if it's up there. We're also developing transcripts, and those take a little longer for us to do, so the recordings might be up before the transcripts. With Katie on vacation, the last proofread of a couple transcripts are in process. So thanks for your understanding with that. And the overview, I'm wondering, Alexandra, if you wouldn't mind with the slideshow, beginning with the slides.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, one moment. Here we go. that up. I put the overview that you're about to say out loud into the chat, but I'm going to also do a screen share. And so that your screen is going to change. I'm also going to invite you to stay muted unless you are choosing to unmute to share. And here we go. Slideshow. The first slide we have is a orange on the left. It says Department of Library series and accessible virtual meetings and events. And on the right hand side, there's a picture of Heidi in a light blue top and surrounded by a sunny grassy day with her name, Director of Community Partnerships. And then a picture of me when my hair was long in actually the same blue dress with a purple scarf, also surrounded by that same sunny grassy day and my name. And then in the bottom right corner is the Inclusive Arts Vermont logo.
Great.
Next we have, what is accessibility?
Okay, so I'm going to pause before we do that, if that's okay, to go over the overview. So what we're going to do today is we're going to define accessibility, and then we're going to talk about different components and considerations for your meetings and events. Then we're going to break it down to before, during, and after the meetings and events. We're going to go over some examples, and then we're going to invite questions and reflections. Side note, you probably are aware that questions and reflections are welcome throughout, but this is just kind of the run through of our time today to have some definitions, some concepts, some examples, and some screen sharing and practical applications. Okay, so usually we ask you a question. Today we're not going to do that except for the rainy weather thing. But I do want to say that for us, the accessibility, what is accessible? What does that mean? And now I believe we have a slide. So Alexandra, I'm going to ask you to share the description of that slide for the group.
Yes, great. So the next slide is a white background. It says, what is accessibility in black text across the top? And there's two pictures. On the left, it's a picture of a parking lot with a, you can see a little bit of the like white lines designating a parking space, and the blue and white accessible symbol of a stick figure in a wheelchair. And then on the right hand side is a screenshot of a Zoom waiting room that says, please wait, the meeting host will let you in soon.
Thank you. So for us and for the purposes of this workshop, these now less than 60 minutes, when we're talking about accessibility, we're talking about accessibility for people with disabilities. And we just want to be clear because we're also aware that in some contexts and some very important conversations and social justice areas, accessibility might also mean financial accessibility. It could mean, access to Wi-Fi. So because there's such a broad definition and broad application of that word, we want to just be clear that what we're focusing on today is access for people with disabilities. And then kind of as a secondary thing to that, looping back to some of the previous workshops where we define disability, just want to remind folks or introduce it into this part of the conversation that disability is also a very layered term and it means different things to different people. So we'll again be addressing accessibility through naming some of the barriers and some of the ways to navigate those barriers. Also, disability is fluid. And so what works for one in terms of accessibility may not be optimal for everybody or even for that same person in a different time. So I like to kind of share that because while we're talking about accessibility, it's not a one size fit all. It's definitely not a cookie cutter approach. And in one conversation before, I was like, cookie cutters are great if you're making cookies. So I just want to share that again. So accessibility is an ongoing process. There's definitely some concrete things that you can do and definitely approaches and practices that you can take, but people are human, people are individual. And so even if you dot all the I's and cross all the T's, there might be something that is missed in terms of access. So we like to parallel it, with the art making process where it's process as well as a product. So while the end result, we want to have inclusion for people with disabilities, all along the way, there's learning and there's back and forth and there's dialogue. And that's sort of a verb approach to accessibility and access. Does that make sense to people? And I'm just going to ask for thumbs up or yeses in the chats Any questions about that sort of approach and that definition?
We're getting some virtual thumbs up.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Yeah. So we're going to move on to the next slide.
Next slide is white in the background, and it says components and considerations. There are 4 bullet points that say digital platforms, creating a parallel with physical spaces, meeting and event engagement and activities, communication materials, and meeting variables. And in the bottom right-hand corner is a photo of what, like the backs of people's heads, right? Many of them raising their hands as they look towards a speaker in the background that's kind of blurry and white curtains.
Thank you. So this is kind of a big chunk of conversation, and Alexandra, maybe we can leave the screen up for a minute, you know, but after a few we can pause it. The first one is, you know, something to consider around digital meetings and events is a parallel to physical accessibility. So for a very long time, and when the Americans with Disabilities Act was first instated, there was lots of discussion about physical accessibility, like parking spaces, like, you know, ramps and aisles. There's a parallel for that in the digital space. And this might not be a new concept since we've now been in the pandemic and doing digital things for a couple of years now. But I think it's a really concrete way to make that parallel. So if you want to have people be able to get into a physical space as a starting prerequisite for the digital platforms, we also want to make sure that the digital spaces are accessible and usable for people with disabilities. So the first thing to do with that is to understand whether the platform you're using is accessible and usable. When Katie and I were meeting with Karen for planning this, we understand that many people in the library's systems use Google Meets. Is that accurate? We give thumbs up or yeses, nos. People are using Google Meets.
I think a lot of people use Zoom for their programs and stuff.
Okay. Both of them have accessibility features. So I just wanted to, thank you for that, Karen, sort of name that the digital spaces all have different kinds of accessibility. And one of the reasons Inclusive Arts Vermont started with Zoom is that early on we called the ADA Center, which we've recommended many times, and just asked what was the most accessible platform, or what was accessible, what was usable. Zoom was recommended at that time, not as a promotion, but because it has a link so people can come in digitally online. And there's also the call-in information so that there's a multiple options so people can call in by phone. And honestly, or not that it would be anything but honest, but because I became familiar and people became familiar with that, we've kind of stuck with it. It's accessible. Things are changing all the time. So when you're considering like the digital accessibility of that first platform space, you want to understand kind of whether it's accessible as a starting place, and then that there's nuances from there. Things you want to think about in terms of the access features that a platform might offer are things like, does it do auto captioning? And I want to thank the person who said, will we be doing how to do auto captioning on Zoom? Yes, the answer is yes. So thanks for that question and the outreach. But when you're looking for your platform, you want to find out, is auto captioning something that's possible? You also want to explore how it works with screen readers and assistive technology, whether there's even an understanding of that. And I'm going through my notes here. Oh, here we go. With American Sign Language, I know we talked a little bit about this last time, but you want to be sure that the platform allows for pinning or spotlighting so that the ASL interpreter's digital box can be linked to the person speaking if there's multiple people. If you have more questions about that, we can go into that later, but just know that not all platforms navigate the accessibility features in the same way, and there's a learning curve with some of that. The next note is that even if the platform is accessible technically, that doesn't mean that it's usable. So just like if you have a physical accessible building, it doesn't mean that somebody's going to know where to find the restroom or where the elevator is. So it's a starting place and it's a foundation. And then from there, just understand that people with disabilities, just like all humans, have varying degrees of technology experience and savvy and interest. So the platform is a starting place, but then recognize that people's usability and then also their familiarity with a program might be different and might differ. And that might also be a barrier that isn't about your platform, but about the person's lived experience or user experience. And there's not anything that you can do about that necessarily, but I just bring it to your attention so that you can be mindful. Again, that even as you do all of these things, there's still going to be human components that are out of your hands, but are still part of the experience. And then lastly, with this particular part about the digital platform, if you have the capacity and you know your audience, you're building relationship with people that are in your programs, if you have the capacity to do a side tutorial so somebody can have practice on the platform without the pressure of it being live, we really encourage that. I think, as people with and without disabilities benefit from different ways of engaging, and I know that Alexandra and I had some practice time, that there's a feeling that's different if you can test it out in a safe environment where there's not an audience around or there's not any worry of mistake. So if you have that capacity or can build in that capacity, sometimes we've had interns that have worked with us that have offered that. And again, it's one of those things that we offer. People don't necessarily take us up on the offer, but it feels like a really important thing to offer because we have that capacity and also that understanding that it's just like a perfection-free zone with the platform itself. Any questions there? And maybe we'll get just makes sense to move on, thumbs up or down.
Yeah, we got a thumbs up. I want to just pull out one thing too, which is, things are always changing, and as much as we can, we try to keep up to date on the different accessibility features, but we can just Google the accessibility and the platform name and get a lot of information. And sometimes when I've actually sent other people that are coming to meetings those kind of tutorials or step-by-step things, even on stuff that like just changing settings or muting or unmuting yourself, sending screenshots ahead of time or a tutorial that people can watch ahead of time can help.
Awesome. Thank you, Alexandra. Awesome. So the next consideration is the meeting and the event itself. My guess is that librarians do lots of different kinds of activities. You might have a read-along, well, not a read-along, a book reading, a story time. There might also be committee meetings, so what you want to think about in terms of accessibility and accessibility for people with disabilities is where's the activity or the goal of the meeting or event that you're having? And to break that down a little bit further, will there be participation? Will it be participatory or will it be sort of one-way presentation? Are there multiple options for people to communicate? So we try to do this, speak out loud in the chat box ahead of time. But really, if you're thinking ahead around universal design for learning, which we've mentioned a few times, and just have multiple options, and you plan for that platform and that meeting to have ways for people to engage, multiple ways for people to engage, that just kind of is inclusive in that way. And that also links to kind of what your goals and your purposes are again. Another consideration is we model this. For some people, having the video off is a really important accessibility feature. And Alexandra and I actually did a presentation where people were going into breakout rooms and then there was the space that was left. And we said, if you don't want to go to a breakout room, just stay here. And a number of the folks, I want to say 5 people stayed in the breakout room instead of going off the call. So that was a way that people could have their videos on or off, that they could opt in or out of some of the activities. That may not be true for every event, but that's just what people could do. And that kept them in the space and kept them engaged in a way, even though it wasn't sort of speaking out loud or doing the things that we sort of have as an expectation that are the ways of engagement. That's not always true. So multiple options for that. It's always okay to pass. It's always okay to pass, just for so many reasons and so many nuances, especially with Zoom. We look really neat and tidy on these screens. We can blur the chaos in the background. But sometimes there's other stuff going on. So it might be passing because, it's a processing thing. It might be passing because if I unmute, the dog's going to be barking, but really just have there always be an okay thing to pass or come back to somebody. And
making that explicit, saying that out loud, so that people feel welcome to do that.
Yeah, thank you. With the chat box, if you know your group, you'll know who accesses the chat box and who doesn't. Sometimes there's chat box conversations that are a parallel process with the spoken. Chat box isn't accessible to everybody. So as a facilitator or as somebody who's leading an event or program, just know to read aloud the chat box. And that is a skill. It's not something that everybody does all the time or everybody knows to do. And certainly not everything in the chat box can be read aloud. There are chat box transcripts. So if somebody wants access to the chat box as a before, during, or after, you can send them a chat box transcript. There's both resources in that and other things. And they also get access to that information in a different time. But just know that kind of the takeaway is that not all types of communication within the platform are available to everybody all the time for many reasons. So just be open or, offer other ways for people to gain that information. Polls and some of the other things, again, there's probably technical ways for that to be accessible to people who are screen readers as one example, but not everybody can access the poll. So if you're going to do a poll, you might check with a group ahead of time to say, if we'll be doing polls, just to have that dialogue back and forth about whether people can use them. Because what you don't want to do is have something that people can't do as part of what moves a meeting or a program along, because then somebody who doesn't have access to that will be excluded. I mean, it's not intentional, but just kind of checking some of the assumptions about what's possible and usable and doable for people, and then having open communication for, both public, but also for different groups that have different purposes or functions within your communities and your programming. The other thing is, will there be a Q&A? So for some of the things we do as Artist Talks, as an example, we know there's a Q&A. You want to invite questions ahead of time, and we can get to registration, but because not everybody fills out the Q&A live and in the moment, there might be a way to say, if you have a question for the presenter, you can email it ahead of time. Again, it's just another option for people to have a back and forth with the information and the communication that's being shared. And just to echo, to design with accessibility in mind, multiple options, multiple options, multiple options. And that might be a change for some of you, it might not, but it's actually less confusing than it might sound once you begin to have a system and build that. Questions or thoughts about that? Doesn't seem like there's any, so I'm gonna move on to the next sort of heading, which is communication materials and marketing materials. For today, we meeting Inclusive Arts Vermont has some recorded workshops that are available through the Vermont Arts Council that talk specifically about social media and digital communications and marketing, graphic design, all of those things. So those are archived and you can access those. For today, though, we want to talk about some of the basics of, the practices around those communications. And we've been modeling this, I hope, in a way that is human, but also effective. So you want to make sure you send the communications ahead of time so that people have the ability to access the information before the event, if that's how they process it. Sometimes people also have a device going, or, with technology, there's multiple ways of doing it, but sending the information ahead of time. And that includes things like an agenda or resources or handouts and slides, which we haven't always done, just note to self. So just that, so people can have that there. That is included with things like, you know, as evidenced or modeled by the Know Before You Go. Having all of that information in one place can be really helpful and useful for people. So that's other key information, like what's the Zoom link to, you know, get in, who can I call if there's a technical difficulty, or how can I reach out, and any of the sort of group agreements or things like that that you might have as part of the group. Now, if you're doing a one-time public event, that information may be less broad or detailed, but it also changes depending on the kind of group, and we'll get there in just a minute. Lastly, the Know Before You Go will have the access information. And we probably said this every time because it's that important. What access features will be offered just as available, and who can people contact if there's something that they're not seeing on that list, and making that as simple as possible and as clear as possible. Because if the purpose of this is accessibility and inclusion, we can take some steps away by just making that information available through the communications that go out ahead of time. There's some details about including links, and I'm just noticing the time, so I'm going to pause very soon with some of this. But when you do a hyperlink for a screen reader user, it will say every letter and try to create a word with that big long link. And right now I'm moving my hands and stretching them. So if you know how to label the link, so it's useful information if somebody's going through just link by link, that's really a helpful tool for screen reader users, but it's also maybe a helpful tool for people who are looking visually to see what the link is. I believe it's colored blue, so it just is a different way to name where the links are located within the text. And then, you know, make sure to, as you can, verbally or visually describe the visuals that are being presented. This is important for a public event if you're not sure. And certainly if somebody's requested that as an access feature, it's a skill that, you know, is ongoing and people can strengthen it. And it's not one that everybody is familiar with. So just know that broader context about verbal description.
All right, we have a question. Can you clarify by what you mean by naming the links? And I think that's like, oh, you can answer it if you want, Heidi.
Why not give it a try, and then you can, you know, add on, and maybe we can.
So if I'm gonna, I think we sent out an email that had a link to a resource from the National Guild about accessible meetings. So it might be like National Guild resource, and then you highlight that text and embed the link in that text rather than having the website with all of the, like, you know, presentation /D/1XBJO. Yeah, great. They got it.
Okay. Thanks for that question. Are there any others before the one last piece?
I want to just note one thing that is sending those things ahead of time, especially if decisions are going to be made based on that information, so that people have a chance to see it ahead of time, because it may not be accessible in the moment.
Great, thank you. Yeah. Yes, thank you. This kind of goes into the next to the type of group that it is. And this is the last sort of other variables and more. Depending on your program or your meeting, and I have a background in social work and a lot of love of group dynamics and process, so I'm going to try to not go too much into the weeds here, but how big is the group? You know, engagement is really different if there's 3 people than if there's 25. And so just knowing ahead of time some things like that. What is the purpose of the group, but also is it a one-time group, or is it something that, you know, is going to be meeting weekly to discuss what to do around inclusion in the city of Springfield? You know, that's a really different kind of group in terms of dynamic and back and forth and relationship building and process time. And it's not that how or the kinds of information that is shared needs to be different, but I think there'll be relationships that are built differently along, you know, a group that's a cohort or a working committee And the back and forth with that could be slightly different in terms of checking in with a person, you know, like, is this working for you? How did this go? What do you need? We talked about this last time, but things like large print, you know, technically 18-point font is the large print minimum, but for somebody as an individual human, that may not be it. So you can provide something that's sort of the standard, if you will. But if your program is a school group that's you know, doing theater with stories, and you know of an access need over time, it just there becomes a relationship that changes the back and forth and how that access is provided and responded to. And you can always check in with a person and everybody about, you know, is this working? What can we do differently? Sort of thing, just to make sure it's there. I'm noticing the time, so I'm going to pause. Alexandra, as you're skimming, have I missed anything from our list ahead of time? I'm guessing I have, but I want to just invite you to.
I don't have anything to say right now.
Okay. Any questions from the folks in the Zoom space? You can raise your hand or speak out loud, put it in the chat box. Okay, I think we'll get into screen share time now.
Okay, and yeah, always put your questions in as they come up, or just unmute and ask out loud. Okay, I'm gonna screen share again, show you the slideshow, and you are getting a chance to hear me do verbal description live right now. This slide has a picture of a woman with brown skin and curly black hair wearing a black shirt with like a little white pattern on it. And she's standing up and like writing on Post-it notes and maybe looking at a board with like Post-it notes and a pen in her hand. And on the right-hand side, it says before. So we're going to talk about what things you can do before the meeting or event, during the meeting or event, and after. So it says before, and then there's 4 things. There's marketing and outreach. There's the know before you go. There's planning and coordinating accommodations. And there's sending the meeting link more than once. So marketing and outreach. We're going to want to make sure that you include the accommodations that will be provided and the access symbol for people to make additional accommodation requests, along with who they should contact to make those requests. You want to make sure that you prepare your presenters and facilitators with those accessibility practices and how they might need to do some of those accessibility practices or interact with them. And multiple means for people to register. So just having an online form doesn't work for everybody. So making sure that there's an option for people to call on the telephone or send an email to register can help make that more accessible. Next, the know before you go. Heidi spent some time talking about that. The idea with the know before you go is that it's a thing that can either get emailed ahead of time or can be posted on a website. And this is designed to take the work off of the person with a disability so they can just easily find information that they'll need to know. In like things like the login details for a meeting, access features, the agenda and outline, and who to contact for troubleshooting. It can also, the know before you go can also include an alternative way of asking questions, like you can email ahead of time a question, ask in the chat box, etc. If possible, send it a week ahead of time and then again closer to the event. And consistency with the template and timing are helpful for ongoing events. Number 3 is planning and coordinating accommodations. And Heidi, you can feel free to jump in here. It says there probably will be some accommodations that are offered regardless of requests. And then there's also accommodations that have been specifically requested. And Heidi, I'm going to invite you to jump in there if there's anything you want to share about that.
Yeah, thank you. We did a workshop last week on meeting accommodation requests, so this sort of cross-pollinates with that. But I think the emphasis here is to just plan in some time for the coordination of that. So it's part of your workflow as best it can be rather than an add-on. And that just helps keep it smooth for everybody.
And then the last little note is just, if possible, send the Zoom link more than once. I typically schedule, when I'm hosting meetings, I will send the Zoom link out a week ahead of time and then schedule it to go out about an hour before the meeting. So it's right on top of people's inboxes and easy to find without a lot of text. Okay, I'm gonna go to the next slide. And this one is a white background. There's two pictures on the left-hand side. One is of a group of people. Looks like they're all sitting down. In the center is a light-skinned person with short, kind of whitish, brownish hair and black-rimmed glasses that looks like they're intently listening. And on the bottom is another picture of a person who looks like they're on a Zoom meeting. There's a kind of a brick wall in the background. They have dark skin and dark hair and a kind of grayish sweater. And they're looking at a computer screen with the, like, we call them the Brady Bunch boxes of 6 other people. So this is gonna give us some information about what we're gonna do during the meeting. There is, the first thing is a link with the National Guild resource. There's a modeling of how to label the link. The next is signing on early, using auto captioning, doing verbal descriptions, and number 5 says, and more, with an exclamation point in true Inclusive Arts Vermont style. Okay, I'm gonna follow the link to the National Guild resource. Let's see if this works. Can we do this? Can you see this? Yes, okay. So the National Guild for Community Arts Education has this great one-page kind of accessibility practices for Zoom meeting thing. This is something that we sent you this link in an email, but I just wanted you to have a chance to take a look. They have before the meeting and during the meeting, there's some kind of visual cues and some text reminders for things that you can do to help make your meetings more accessible. I'm going to go back to this one. Okay, so this includes signing on early, using verbal descriptions of any of yourself and surroundings, of anyone who's speaking, and inviting people to do that also. And it's getting less and less new, but it's still relatively new. So we often send people a resource ahead of time on how to do verbal description of themselves and surroundings, so that that's not new in the moment, especially in a meeting that's going to be interactive and we're going to ask people to have, you know, to be identifying themselves. So we'll send a little tip sheet on how to do that ahead of time. Identifying yourself when speaking so that everyone knows who's talking. Making access announcements like at the beginning of the meeting. Taking regular scheduled breaks. Encouraging multiple ways to participate. Reading the chat box out loud. Using a microphone and headphones, which I admit I have never done, but it is best practice to make it more clear. And avoiding a busy background, and encouraging participants to mute when they're not speaking to kind of keep the focus on the person who is speaking. Yeah. Questions or thoughts there? Okay. Next, we have things that you can do after the meeting, including,
there was a request to show the captioning, the auto captioning on Zoom. Is that on your list for after we go through the slides, or is that?
It's not on my list, but we can do that right now.
Yeah.
All right, but then this gets confusing to me. All right, how do I do this? You all see my slideshow, not my Zoom screen, correct? Karen, nod your head if you can see, only my second. So what do I have to do? All right, sorry, now we're getting into tech things. So turning on transcription when you are hosting the meeting. It is different on different devices, a laptop versus a phone versus a tablet. But I don't know how to show this to you, unfortunately, because I don't know how to screen share my Zoom screen.
Okay, so I'm going to make a suggestion, and maybe we finish the slide and then we can field some questions, and if you logged in as Alexandra somewhere, we could maybe see Alexandra's screen.
I'm working on that now to see if I can do that.
Okay, so while you're doing that, if it's not distracting to you, Alexandra, I'll just say that one of the things we tested out, is it okay if I talk while you're teching?
Yes, please do. I'm concerned if I sign out, I'll disappear, but Karen's the co-host, and so we'll just see.
And because of the screen share and, you know, the request, the auto captioning is something that we've talked about in many of the workshops, and it's become a feature that it's not just for people who are hard of hearing. And so I think it's important that we at least attempt to show you kind of what it looks like, but also narrate how to find it. I'm curious if there's people here, who here has set up auto captioning, and maybe we can get a thumbs up, show of hands, or a yes in the chat boxes. Have people here set up auto captioning?
We got some thumbs up, and we have some notes in the chat that the auto transcriptions are on, right? I know that they're on. We're trying to show you how to turn them on, and then we can take screenshots and send them in the follow-up. But I think I'll be able to do it. I'm not sure, but I think I'll be able to do it over here. We'll see.
Okay. The other thing Alexandra mentioned that I just want to echo and reiterate is that these platforms are changing kind of all the time. So we noticed in our experimenting and our practice that it was referred to as closed caption. Sometimes it was called transcript. Sometimes it was called subtitles. And it appeared to us that it was the text on the screen showing up as people were talking, which we've been referring to as auto captioning. So when somebody requests auto captioning or that closed captioning, or that's the feature that we're trying to demonstrate now. I also, as I was playing with it with Alexandra, and we were co-hosting and back and forth, there's a way that participants can request the auto captioning be turned on. And I'm not sure if people have experimented with that, but if you're hosting a Zoom meeting, somebody can request the auto captioning be turned on. And I was really thrilled to see that, because that shares the responsibility between the facilitators and the audience members for people to have an access request made. So again, the auto captioning is becoming pretty familiar in many places. And so people in the audience and the participants can request it. And I also noticed you can request it anonymously, which I thought was kind of a privacy thing, since there's still some shame attached to disability, unfortunately. But just know that if you are the facilitator and you don't have your voiceover turned off, there will be a way that people can, you know, check in with you and keep in communication about what their access needs are in the moment. And then also there's ways as the audience member to turn it on and off. If we don't get through all those variables now, you can come to the office hours next week and KB can screen share and practice and experiment, or we could set up a one-on-one to play with it. But I want to thank the person for that question, because it's really important. It's not just for people with hearing loss, you know, people with focus and learning disabilities. It's just, or who need to turn the volume down so that they can rock their child to sleep, or they're maybe in a library, you know, all sorts of access needs.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna, people are in the chat sort of talking about how to find it on their own screens, which is great. If I, as the host, haven't turned it on, I think that you won't be able to do that, but maybe you will, I'm not sure. What I can do is right now I'm gonna screen share and show you how it looks on Google Meets. I can't start another meeting to screen share on Zoom, so I will send screenshots after this, but I wanted to show you now on Google Meets. So we have a meeting over here in the middle. On the bottom of my Google Meet screen, there's a little sort of grayish circle with 3 little white dots, and it's similar to this on Zoom also. If I click that, it says more and then more options. And here in the middle, there's that sort of closed caption symbol. On the left, it's 2 little C's in a black box, and it says turn on captions. And if I click that, now the captions have been turned on. I can change the language. And so now it's doing this kind of auto transcript. And I just want to acknowledge that it is never, these are like, you know, AI, it's not perfect. If you notice in the beginning of the meeting, we talked about when Heidi was doing the land acknowledgement, I put in the correct spelling of Abenaki because it doesn't always come through. The best choice is always to have a live actual person doing the transcript who's trained to do it, but that's not always possible for timing or budgetary reasons. So that is the story there. Brief thing.
Yeah, thanks, Alexander. The one thing I want to add to that, and I think we've mentioned this before, is that for ADA accessibility standards, the auto captioning doesn't meet those standards. But for the individual human, it might be okay. So that's where you might, if somebody requests captions, you would just have a dialogue back and forth about what works for them. Understanding that the auto captioning is wonderful and it works for many people for many reasons. It may not work for everybody, and it may not be what meets the sort of requirements of the law, if you will. And that's something that if you get that request or that conversation, you can call the New England ADA Center. But for many things, it's a really great resource, and it's great to know about how to set it up because it comes in the moment. Like, you get this request to turn on the auto captioning.
Yeah. And so in Zoom, I can just kind of talk it through. It's just almost in the same spot as on Google Meets. It's in the middle on the bottom, and it says live transcript, and it has the same little closed captioning symbol. And if I click on that, I can choose, as the host of the meeting, I can choose to assign a participant to type, for myself to type, to use a third-party closed captioning service, or to enable auto transcription, which is what I've done for this meeting today. Okay, so that's all of the during the meeting things that we had to talk about.
I think so. Thanks for the detour. I just wanted to.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And thanks for everybody's patience and me trying to figure out if I could screen share a separate Zoom meeting. Wasn't possible. Okay, so after I'm going to just give you a quick return to our little slideshow here. On this slide, we have a picture of a man with dark skin. He's wearing headphones and a light colored shirt, and he's sitting in a wheelchair at a wooden table, and he has his hands on a laptop computer, and he's wearing glasses. And on the right-hand side, we have what's going to happen after the meeting is that we're going to follow up and do an evaluation. So follow-up communication can include any of the resources that were shared in the chat during the moment, or anything that came up. Like, I'm going to send you all screenshots of how to turn on closed captioning during Zoom meetings. And also giving an evaluation that will give folks a way to provide feedback for potential improvements in the future. Anything you want to share there, Heidi?
No, I think, yeah, I think that, well, I say no and then I'm talking. So yes, I sometimes we think about this sort of before and the preparation and all of that. And at Inclusive Arts Vermont, we highlight that as something to consider and build in terms of access, because, you know, coordinating ASL, for example, does take some calendar time. But I also think it's equally important to know that just when the meeting's done, and Katie and I have said this in workshops before, it doesn't mean we're done, especially because, you know, for access purposes, sometimes brains process later, or it doesn't feel safe to ask a question in the moment. So the follow-up, I think, is a really critical component of accessibility and inclusion, in the sense of providing the information as a wrap-up, but also that ongoing back and forth relationship of how can we improve, what worked well, what can we do differently, with that understanding that we're all human and accessibility is fluid. So there's ways that can be, you know, simple, as you might notice if you've been with this workshop series before. We send out an evaluation that people can fill out. We try to make it that something that won't take a lot of time, just because we're aware of people's capacity. But really the intention there is to hear from people if we need to make something that's different, or also what worked really well. And I think that that's just something we want to pass on for accessibility, because not everybody will communicate in the moment. And there's really important things to be learned and then shifted after the fact in terms of access. We're always learning. So now I'm done.
Awesome. So we have a few moments for questions. If anyone has any lingering questions, you can toss them in the chat, unmute and ask them out loud.
While we were waiting for any, did we just get one?
Yeah, can you pause?
Yeah, of course.
Karen, did you want to say something?
Yeah, sorry. I was just going to ask if you had, in your experience, ever come across a sort of like accommodation request during a digital meeting in the moment that you just were stumped with and had a hard time figuring out how to make that meeting accessible for someone? If you had an example of that. If not, it's okay. Just was wondering.
The short answer is not so much stumped in the moment, but I'm going to take a step back and just do a really broad, like, especially with digital events, technology has its challenges regardless of disability and access and inclusion. And I think that sometimes communication differences because of disability, it's not intensified, but they show up in a way that adds to the technical stuff and the shifting and the moving and the changing. And sometimes what's working for one isn't working for another. So there's just that layer. And I think when those moments happen, it can be really awkward and unfortunate and hopefully not hurtful to the people who are not being included. One example came up recently with ASL, and there's a difference with Zoom between pinning and spotlighting. And depending how many Zoom boxes are in the space, this is a lesson learned very recently. If you pin it, the person who's reading the ASL has those privileges and can match the ASL interpreter with the speaker. But if it's a public audience and it's going Zoom square, like a big Zoom square, you have to spotlight the ASL interpreter so it is linked to the thing that's presented to the public. That keeps shifting. And those are two very different things. And, it's a little bit of a learning curve. It's a little bit of somebody in a chat box saying, hey, this isn't working. And then, the facilitator. So we have co-facilitators for lots of reasons. I think it's a best practice. Maybe this is my personal thing because I don't always value independence, but I think that there's different tasks. So there's somebody who's presenting and maybe somebody who's listening and responding to all the tech stuff. And that might not be doable for everybody, but the accommodations part come into digital spaces partly because of the technology itself and learning curves and nuances and changes. And while I would love to be that, I am sometimes. I love the part of me that's like, woo, look, an adventure, a new technology. And if there's any astrology people out there, like there's some Gemini in me where it's like the equal and opposite of that, which is like, oh no, another technology change. So I'm not making light of it, just trying to be human about accessibility is really, it's not going to be perfect. We're humans, we're all learning. And I think part of my experience, but I also focus on relationship and asking the person and following up is that checking in my experience of people, I'll use my lived, people check in with me about how it's going. That feels so different than like some loose end of not a communication, because for me, I'm aware that verbal description is not the usual for everybody. Like it's a learning curve for everybody. And while I don't want that to be the situation for everybody, and I've heard the phrase communication equity recently, and I was like, wow, that's kind of a phrase to sit with. There's steps between now and ideal that involve humans and conversations and learning and growing. And sometimes that comes up with a tech glitch or something that you don't know in the moment and have to figure out after. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, we have just like 2 more minutes. Heidi, we got a question in the chat. Do you send out surveys in different ways so they are accessible for different needs?
Yes. Yes.
Can you say some of those ways that we send it out?
Yes. So for this workshop series, but in general, we've kind of come to the Google form, which then we take and like it's all compiled. I say we, that's actually not me because I don't do the Google form so well. We also then add the word attachment, understanding that some people are Mac users. And then we include in that an email and a phone number in case somebody wants to do it without the written word, but just spoken. And I would say 99% of people use the Google form, which is not to say it's better or worse, but just, like providing those options as a template. So the Google form, a Word document attachment, and then a phone and email, again, as other options. People can set up phone numbers that are not personalized now, that are linked to like Google whatevers. And I don't know how to do that myself, but I know that there's a couple people on our team that do that just to keep it from being private and also, being able to manage this text and things that way. So maybe some of you already do that. I'm
gonna just screen share our last slide real quick in this last minute. And it says, hold on, there's always like, okay, there's always a little lag because the Zoom box is over. Okay, please complete our survey. Heidi will send it out in an email. Is that right, Heidi?
Yes, but I'm gonna wait for screen share slides.
Okay, okay. And then, so this is a white slide that says thank you. And then it has our last 4 steps, which is complete our survey. There'll be office hours on June 30th from 1 to 2 p.m. You can sign into that or call in to ask any questions you might have after the series. The Department of Libraries website will have the recordings, and feel free to reach out to Heidi with any questions that you might have. Her email address is heidi@inclusiveartsvermont.org, or you can call 802-238-5170. And that is also available at our website if you want to go there. Thank you very much for coming today. It's 2 o'clock.
Yeah. Thank you, Alexandra, and thank you everybody for your time and presence and your learning. And please stay in touch and should come to office hours next week if you have still have questions.